Good afternoon, students. Today is Thursday, 22 April 2021. Today is the first of 2 days on the article by Jan Narveson. We will finish up this essay in 2 days. I'm running a little bit behind this week, but you'll get your 2 lectures today and Saturday. That will leave only 3 days remaining in the semester. We'll devote all 3 of those days to the final reading in the course, an essay about what the authors call after-birth abortion by authors named Jubilini and Minerva. Now, I'll get that posted for you in the next day or so, probably no later than tomorrow, so you can get started reading it over the weekend. So the semester is winding down quite fast. Today and Saturday, Narveson, and then both days next week, Jubilini and Minerva. And the final lecture will be on the following Tuesday, and that will be the third lecture on Jubilini and Minerva. Sorry, my voice is a little bit weak today. I hope you can hear me all right. Our exam is 19 days from now. Today's the 22nd, and the exam is on the 11th of May, 19 days from now. Okay, so let's get started. We've already had a nice introduction to the political theory called libertarianism. In my most recent lecture, we devoted it to a chapter of a book written by John Hospers. So I hope by now you have a pretty good understanding of what libertarianism is. And today, what we're going to do is apply that theory to the question of healthcare. Jan Narveson is a libertarian, and he believes that there is no right to health care, no positive right, I should say. And we'll clarify the difference between a positive right and a negative right sometime today. Now, since we have 2 days to cover this essay, I've drawn a line in my notes. I think we'll get up to part 2, which is entitled Rights. And then on Saturday, we'll finish things up. Okay, a little bit about Narveson. To my knowledge, he's still alive. He was born in 1936, so sometime this year he will be 64, 85 years old, it looks like. 64, 65, yes, 85 years old sometime this year. He was born in Minnesota, so he's an American by birth, but for some reason he's taught for most of his career in Canada. Maybe he happened to get a job in Canada and found it to his liking and decided never to leave. He has gone through some changes in his views, moral and political views. He began his career as a utilitarian. In fact, he wrote a well-regarded book defending utilitarianism. He then became what's called a contractarian, someone who believes that the basis of morality is a contract between individuals. And for many years now, he has been a libertarian, a proponent of small government. So he's, like many of us, has been through some changes in his views. So he divides his essay up into various parts. You'll see on the first page, he has part 1, the issue, and later he has a part called rights. So let's just cover part 1 today. There's plenty to discuss. It's in some ways introductory. He's making appropriate distinctions and laying out his general framework. And then on Saturday, we'll finish things up. Now, where did this essay come from? How did it originate? It didn't just come out of thin air. Narveson must have had a reason for writing it. And it looks to me as though he was invited to contribute an essay to the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. And by the way, I'm pretty sure I posted my lecture notes for Narveson on Canvas, so you may want to go pause this video and go to Canvas, print out my lecture notes, and then bring them back so that you can follow along as I go through my lecture notes. So there's a journal called the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, and it looks as though the editor wanted a range of views on a particular question. And it looks like he or she invited Narveson because he's a well-known libertarian. And the editor must have wanted somebody to make the case that there's no positive right to health care. And who better to do that than a libertarian such as Jan Narveson? So here is the editor's question. I'm going to read this from page 558, which is the very first page of the article. It goes like this. Narveson says, our question is this from the editors of this issue. Quote, in 1983, the President's Commission released a report entitled Securing Access to Health Care, which concluded that there were normative reasons for ensuring access to an, quote, adequate level of care, unquote, for all Americans. Most believe that this standard has yet to be achieved in American healthcare. More recently, Congress has considered mandating coverage for all Americans and mandating that employers cover all employees. But this raises the question, coverage of what? The terms decent minimum or adequate coverage have been absent from the debate. And they add this more fundamental question. In other words, Narveson is telling us the editors of the journal add a follow-up question. Is there a natural or moral right to such healthcare access? Or does the government have a moral duty to provide it? Now that's a little bit misleading because I think what the editors are saying is there a right to health care? Put in different terms, does the government have a moral duty to provide health care? So we could look at it from either the point of view of the individual citizen who may or may not have a right to health care, or we could look at it as a duty on the part of government to provide health care to each citizen. So there's simply two ways you could phrase the question. So it seems to me that's how this essay came about. Narveson probably gladly accepted the offer to write an essay, and what you are reading, what you have read, is the result of it. So the question of this essay, which Narveson answers, is this. Does the government have a moral duty to provide health care? And Narveson's answer is a flat no. No moral duty. And therefore, no right, no positive right on the part of individuals to have any health care provided to them by other citizens through the government or directly. Narveson says on pages 569 and 570, quote, there's no level of health such that governments have any business compelling anyone to bring it about, that everyone enjoys at least that level of health, and certainly that they have access to a given level of health care. Notice he put the term health care in quotation marks. So Narveson is very emphatic, very clear, very emphatic. There's no positive right to health care. Now you may be wondering, why do I keep saying positive right? Because Narveson does believe that there's a negative right to health care, and in a moment he's going to tell us exactly what that includes. Remember, we learned this from Hospers the other day. Libertarians believe in negative rights. We have rights to be left alone by other citizens and by the government. We have lots of rights. The right to speak, the right to life, the right to property, the right to liberty. But all of those rights are negative. None of them is positive. They're all rights to be left alone so that we can speak our minds on various topics. We have a right not to be killed or injured. We have a right to create property, to earn property, and to enjoy property. So we have lots of rights, according to libertarians like Narveson, but they're all negative. What he denies is that we have a positive right to health care, a right to have health care provided to us by others, including the government. Now, let's define a term before we move on. This is very important. Let's define the term government securing access to health care. Now, that must be part of the question raised by the editor, although I don't see it in here glancing at it. But many people do use this term, so it needs to be defined. What does it mean to say that government secures access to health care? Well, according to Narveson, that means the following. That means the government, with its coercive powers, taxes citizens, collects the tax money, which is called revenue, and then allocates that revenue or spends that money in various ways. So if government is securing access to health care, that means it's taking money from some and giving it to others. Now, some of the people from whom the money is taken may also receive health care, but there could logically be someone who contributes money to the government and doesn't receive health care, or more likely, someone who doesn't contribute to the government but does receive health care. Someone who's poor, for example, may owe no taxes. And if you owe no taxes, you have nothing to pay to the government. And yet you may still have a right to health care provided by the government. So I'm not suggesting that one group of citizens do all of the paying and some other group receives the health care. There's an overlap between them. Right? A lot of people who pay taxes under certain schemes would also get health care. My point is that not everyone is in both of those categories. There could be someone who doesn't pay taxes but does receive health care provided by the government. All right, so now let's turn to that question of negative and positive rights, because that turns out to be a crucial distinction for a libertarian like Hospers or Narveson. Now, we did discuss this question the other day when we read and discussed the essay by John Hospers. You can see on the first page of my notes, I have a diagram, a 2x2 box diagram, and I have on the left side, I make a distinction between negative and down below positive rights, and on the top I have right and duty. So we have four categories. We have negative rights, negative duties, positive rights, and positive duties. So let's begin with a negative right, and this is a refresher. This is simply a review of what we've already learned. A negative right, according to Narveson and Hospers, is a right to be left alone by others. It's a right that others forbear from harming you. It's a right not to be interfered with by others as you go about your business, such as pursuing happiness. It's a right not to be coerced, constrained, or compelled. So a negative right is a right to be left alone. Imagine the bubble. Imagine each of us inhabits a bubble and we're floating around in society doing our thing. The libertarian says, no one may go into your bubble without your permission. That bubble represents your sovereign domain. Right? It represents your rights, your negative rights against others. Now, you're always free to let other people come into your bubble or burst your bubble, if you want to think of it that way. If you go to see a doctor in Oregon to assist you in killing yourself under their assisted suicide law, you are allowing someone to come into your bubble and either kill you or help you kill yourself. That's voluntary, right? You have a right to end your life, according to the libertarian. So you can let people into your bubble to bring about your death. You can give away your property through a bequest upon your death or as a gift during your lifetime. Notice that's voluntarily disposing of your property through gift or inheritance. You can relinquish some of your liberty if you so desire. Right? That would be allowing someone to come into your bubble and keep you from doing something. So that's you're self-limiting your own liberty. And finally, you can give away your property. Oh, I already mentioned that one. You can restrict your own speech. You can stifle yourself if you want. You have a right to speak. You have a right to be left alone so that you can speak your mind to others. You can voluntarily stifle yourself and not speak. And that's up to you. But you can't be made to stifle yourself by others, including the government. So that's what a negative right is, a right to be left alone, to exercise your rights within your bubble as you see fit. Now, according to Hospers, well, let's turn now to the concept of a positive right. It's immediately below the negative right on this diagram. A positive right is a right to the provision of a good or service or some kind of assistance by others. So a positive right is not a right to be left alone. It's a right to have something you need or want provided by others. It's a right to have other people bring something into your bubble for you to use. Okay? It's not just a right to stay out of my bubble. It's come into my bubble and help me or provide something to me, a good or a service. So a positive right is much stronger than a negative right. I hope you can see that. Now, on the right side of my diagram, I have duties. And corresponding to each of these rights is a duty. So if you look at the box that says negative duty in the northeast quadrant of my diagram, if you have a negative duty to others, to one or more others, that's a duty to leave them alone. It's a duty to forbear from harming them. It's a duty not to interfere with them as they go about their business. It's a duty not to coerce or compel anybody or constrain anybody. So those two go hand in hand, don't they? If the negative right to be left alone is correlated with a a negative duty to leave others alone. And to a libertarian, everybody has both of those negative rights and negative duties. We all have a right to be left alone, and we all have a corresponding duty to leave others alone. So, to a libertarian, a perfect world is one where we're all in our bubble, and the only collisions that occur are those that are voluntary. The only time any bubbles touch one another or bump into one another is when we request it and when two people agree on it. Other than that, you need to stay out of my bubble, don't bump into my bubble, leave me alone. Okay? Now, obviously, there are going to be some collisions between people's bubbles, and that's why we need a criminal justice system and a tort system. We talked about that the other day. And those are going to cost money. So libertarians are going to require taxation up to a certain amount in order to fund or provide for these essential governmental services. The court system with police officers, prosecutors, judges, all of whom are paid by tax dollars. The courtroom, the court building, the courthouse building must be built and maintained. It must have electricity and running water and so on. So libertarians are not anarchists. Anarchists are opposed to all government. They say that no government is justified, therefore no laws are justified. Libertarians disagree with that. They believe that a small, minimal government is justified, but nothing more than that. They call it a night watchman state. A night watchman or woman who stays inside of a museum or something is there to keep intruders out. And that's the function of government, according to libertarians. We need police officers to stand guard and prevent crime and apprehend criminals when they commit crimes. And we need a military force that's adequate to keep out invaders. Okay, so libertarians advocate not no state at all, which is anarchism. They advocate a minimal state, a night watchman state, they call it. Okay, suppose there's a positive right. Suppose you have a right to someone's assistance or provision of some good or service. Then some other person has a duty to provide it to you. And these two ideas go hand in hand. Whenever somebody has a positive right, at least one other person has a positive duty, okay? A positive duty to provide it to that person. So I told you a moment ago that Hospers and Narveson believe in negative rights only. Let's now see what a negative right to health care would amount to. So if you're looking at my lecture notes, you can turn to page 2. Narveson identifies 3 items that are included in a negative right to health care. Number 1 is a right to refuse medical treatment. Someone may want to treat you medically for some ailment that you have, but you always have the right to say no. Leave me alone. I don't want that surgery. I know you want to do it. I know you think it's for my own good. I appreciate the concern, but I don't want it. And I have a right that you not do it to me. Okay, so your right not to have this procedure performed on you trumps the goodness of the person who wants to perform it. So in this case, your autonomy trumps beneficence. Beneficence means doing good. So a doctor who, let's say, wants to perform surgery on you for your own good, the doctor is benevolent and is trying to do an act of beneficence, an act of doing good. But you, for some reason, don't want it. And you have every right to say, no, I don't want to be treated, or I don't want to be treated in that way. So stop it. Okay? So the negative right to health care includes, at a minimum, the right to refuse any medical care or treatment that's being offered to you. Now, others may try to persuade you, and that's perfectly fine. That's legitimate according to libertarians. Rational persuasion is always permissible because it's not coercive. It doesn't involve force or coercion or manipulation. It's an attempt to give you good reasons to believe and do something, and that's permissible. Now, you may get tired of it. If someone is trying to persuade you to undergo a certain course of medical treatment and you've decided you don't want it, you may politely listen to the argument, and when it's done, you may say, I'm not persuaded, thank you for trying, but I still don't want you to go ahead with the procedure. If the person persists at that point in trying to persuade you, it's starting to become coercive. It's starting to become an interference with you. And you have every right to complain about that and say, listen to me. I gave you a chance to persuade me. You made your case. I listened carefully. I'm not persuaded. Thank you for trying. I'm done. We're done. Okay? Stop. And at some point, if the person persists, you would be entitled to call in someone and have that person removed. That person is now bothering you. That person is now restricting you or constraining you. So you have a right to refuse treatment that's compatible with other people trying to persuade you to undergo the treatment, but it's also compatible with you eventually saying, no, stop, I'm tired of listening to you, leave, go somewhere else. Okay, here's the second thing or aspect that's included in a negative right to health care. I'm reading from the top of page 2 of my notes. A right not to be harmed. So my negative right to health care means that I have a right to be left alone. Other people may not, even if they're well motivated, come in and do things that harm me. Others, according to Narveson on page 559, others may not damage my health, make me sick, injure me, or at the extreme, kill me. Now, this is different from the first point I made. The first point involved beneficence, where the person was trying to do good to you. Now we've shifted gears. Now we're looking at someone who's maleficent, someone who's trying to harm you or do bad things to you. and you have a right that they not do it. I have a right that you leave me alone. Don't do things that make me sick, damage my health, injure me in any way, or at the extreme, kill me. Okay, so that's included in the negative right to health care. Don't do things that interfere with my health or damage my health. According to Narveson on page 560, now I put some bracketed items in here just to make it read more smoothly. I wanted to put it in the first person as though I'm speaking. My fellows may not worsen my health, not make me sick, not disable or otherwise injure me, and especially not kill me. So really, Narveson is saying the same thing twice. He said it on page 559. He said it again on the following page. All right, so that's the second of three aspects of the negative right to health care. Here's number 3. If you have a negative right to health care, you have a right not to be prevented from seeking and contracting for medical care. Unfortunately, Narveson would say, that's not the case in Canada. So I'll come back to Canada in a moment. Here's what Narveson says on page 565. No one may prevent me from making such purely voluntary arrangements as I can to advance my interests. So here's the situation. Suppose I have a negative right, and only a negative right, to health care. Okay? Leave aside whether I have a positive right. I do have a negative right to health care. That means that my health care is my own business. And if I want to go find someone, a doctor or anyone else, who will minister to my health care needs for a fee, I have every right to do so. I have a right to enter into contractual arrangements with people for my own health. And anybody who interferes with that, who tries to prevent me from entering into a contract like that, is violating my negative right to health. You see that? So the negative right to health care includes a right to go out and find someone to contract with for the provision of health care. It's a mutually voluntary arrangement. Now, let's come back to Canada. Narveson lives in Canada, and the Canadians, as you probably know, have a different healthcare system than we have in this country, the United States. And we don't need to go into all the differences right now, but one difference between Canada and the US is that in Canada, not only does everyone have a right to health care under the law, a positive right to health care, a universal positive right to health care. That's the situation in Canada today. But in Canada, nobody has a negative right to health care, at least in terms of contracting with other individuals. So Narveson cannot, while he's in Canada, Narveson cannot go out, find a doctor, and enter into a contract with that doctor to provide for Narveson's health care. That's illegal in Canada. Everyone must go through the government-provided healthcare system in Canada. So Narveson would complain that his negative right to health care is being violated by the government of Canada. The government is telling him, no, you cannot go to a doctor of your choosing to get health care, even if you can find a doctor who's willing to provide it, and even if you're willing to pay for it. You have to go through the system provided by the government like everyone else. We'll say more about this in a few minutes. I'm going to bring in the healthcare system of Great Britain, and we're going to look at how Canada, Great Britain, and the United States differ from one another and how they're alike. You may be surprised what we find there. Okay, moving on. We still have a couple more pages to cover before we're done for today. Let's talk a little bit about the correlativity of rights and duties. Now, we talked about this at least once in this course, and it was the other day when we covered hospers. How are rights and duties related? Is there a correlation. Notice the word correlation means co-relation. So when you say that two things are correlated, that means that they're connected and that the connection goes both ways. Right? If you have this, you also have this. If you have this, you also have this. So it goes from right to left and from left to right. Does Hospers believe that rights and duties are correlated in that way? The answer is no. Hospers believes that for every right there's a duty, but he does not believe that for every duty there's a right. So let me explain. Suppose someone has a right, whether it's positive or negative doesn't matter right now. But suppose I have a right, then there has to be at least one person who has a duty. What would be the point of me having a right if no one else had a duty toward me? So here's what Hosper says about that on page 561. He says, a right that implies no duties is a useless idea. It is simply not in any interesting sense a right at all. To say that someone has a right is to say that someone else has a duty. So we know very clearly, because it couldn't have been stated any more clearly, Narveson believes that rights entail duties. What that means is, as you see down below, it's impossible. Suppose S has a right. Suppose rights entail duties. That means it's impossible for someone, call that person S, to have a right without some other person, T, having a duty. Okay, that's what that means. Rights entail duties. It's a very strong claim. It means it's impossible for someone to have a right without someone else having a duty. And Narveson endorses that. What about the other relation? Does Narveson believe that every duty entails a corresponding right? He says, he doesn't say this explicitly, but it's pretty clear from reading his essay, he does not believe that. He wants to leave open the possibility that someone could have a duty without someone else having a right. For example, maybe we have duties not to damage or destroy the environment. It might sound odd to say that the environment has rights. We have duties with respect to the environment, but the environment doesn't have rights in return with respect to us. So I think Narveson, many philosophers, and I think Narveson may be one of them, do not want to say that duties entail rights. There could be a duty without a correlative right. In fact, if you go back in this course a ways, remember Carl Cohen? Carl Cohen, remember we read his essay on animal experimentation? Carl Cohen made it very clear that he believes that there can be duties or obligations without corresponding rights. In fact, Cohen said we have obligations to animals, not to harm them without a good reason. But animals do not have rights against us. He was very clear about that. We have duties to animals, but animals do not have rights against us. So I think Narveson holds that same view. I think Narveson's view is that rights entail duties, but duties do not entail rights. Now let's read a little bit from page 561. If you go up above where I was just reading. With negative rights, Narveson says, it is the duty to refrain. With positive rights, it's the duty to provide the help needed, when and if it is needed, and we're able to make the provision in question. So what he's saying is, if we're dealing with negative rights, then every negative right entails a negative duty. If we're dealing with positive rights, every positive right entails a positive duty. What Narveson rejects is the other direction. He would say there could be a negative duty without there being a negative right, and there could be a positive duty without there being a positive right. Okay, so of those two claims, the one that we can be quite sure of is that for Narveson, rights entail duties. I'm suspecting that he rejects the other one. He rejects the view that duties entail rights. But he doesn't come right out and say it. I want to be honest about that. He doesn't come right out and say it, but it's a position many people hold, like Carl Cohen, and I think Narveson holds that view as well. I just can't point to a particular place in his essay where he says that. Okay, so what is the case for negative rights? How does Narveson support the proposition that we have negative rights in general or negative rights to health care in particular? He says on page 562, the case for a general and generous allotment of negative rights is, I think, clear to the point of being simply overwhelming. So if you just read that one sentence, it sounds like Narveson is saying, we don't even need to argue for this because it's so widely accepted. It's just obvious. It would be proving what's widely known or proving what's common sense. So Narveson doesn't really make an argument that we have negative rights. He says there's no point in proving it because everyone already believes it. He says everyone agrees that we have negative rights, such as the right to refuse medical treatment. And this is the basis of what's called the harm principle. The harm principle says that that one of the legitimate functions of government is to protect us from harm from other people. And everybody accepts that except anarchists. Everyone, whether you're a libertarian or a socialist or any other political philosophy except anarchism, everyone believes that if you are harmed, other people, the person who harmed you is liable either criminally or civilly. It's a legitimate function of government to have laws that are designed to prevent us from harming each other. So that's an application of the harm principle. And so the reason Narveson doesn't feel compelled to argue for negative rights is that everybody but anarchists believes that it's a legitimate function of government to protect us in our rights against others, to prevent harm by one person to another. You see that? So the negative rights that we have flow from the harm principle, which everyone but anarchists accepts. So let's turn our attention to positive rights. Many people believe that there's both a negative right to health care and a positive right to health care. Narveson's view is that there's a negative right to health care, but not a positive right to health care. So Narveson owes us an explanation and perhaps an argument as to why there's no positive right to health care. So let's turn to page 563 of his essay and see what he says about this. I'm flipping through my copy. You can see it's all marked up with red ink, black ink, blue underlining, lines up and down the margin, notes in the margins, and so on. When I read, I feel like I'm in a wrestling match, right? I've got a pen in my hand with markers handy, and I'm focused. I don't have music playing. I don't have any distractions. Although today we've got construction work going on right in front of our house, on the house being built across the street. So it's kind of a distraction, but you have to live with certain distractions, I guess. But when I'm reading something, especially something written by a philosopher, I am totally focused. I read it very slowly, very carefully. I keep reading the same sentence over and over until I think I understand it. I ask questions in the margin with my pen. I underline, I make arrows, and so on. You should learn how to read that way. You should never read a philosophical essay the way you read a novel or a magazine or a newspaper. Okay? Philosophy deserves your undivided attention. Okay? You and the author are in a wrestling match. Now, I'm not saying you're trying to beat the author, but you shouldn't let the author bowl you over either. You should read every sentence that author writes with a skeptical eye. Now, you should ask yourself, do I accept that? Has the author provided any reasons for me to believe that? Is the author assuming something that needs to be defended or supported? Sometimes the author will ignore a relevant question, and you can raise that as a question of your own. Maybe the author will come back to it later and answer it. So read actively as though you and the author were having a conversation. Well, I want to read the first full paragraph on page 563, because that's the paragraph in which Narveson sets out his reasons for believing that there's no positive right to health care. Here we go. He says, now we can get back to proposals about positive rights. Minimal income, minimal education, minimal medical care? Really? Now, one thing I like about Narveson is his writing has a conversational tone to it. You don't often see this in a philosophical publication. He's being almost sarcastic. Minimal income, minimal education, minimal medical care? Really? You can imagine him saying it with that tone of voice. Is there a real claim that we will all rationally unite behind the proposal to require contributions from all, and especially all our fellow country persons in the particular nation state we happen to live in for those purposes? That there's not is at least suggested by the fact that these claimed duties do not extend beyond the borders of political states. Governments want to impose such things, of course, but the fact that governments want us to do X falls well short of assuring that X is right. Fascism, in moral theory, surely does not merit serious discussion. Now, there's a lot packed in there. Let me try to unpack some of it. There's a little bit of sarcasm thrown in. That's probably not a good idea in a philosophical essay, but it's part of Narveson's style. It's endearing to some people. It's off-putting to other people. I would prefer maybe less sarcasm. I'm not opposed to sarcasm in general. I tend to be sarcastic in various situations, but when I'm writing a philosophical essay for publication, I try to shy away from that kind of rhetoric. Anyway, that's his style, and we'll just have to live with it. Narveson is saying there that it's not obvious, at the very least, it's not obvious that there's a positive right to things like education, healthcare, and income. It's not obvious. These things have to be argued for. And it's not an argument in favor of them that the government wants money from citizens. Right? Of course, governments always want money. They always want more money. They're insatiable. Right? They would love to have more taxes. They tax up to the point at which they think people will start to rebel against them. Remember what started the American Revolution? One of the main grievances was taxation. The Great Britain, England specifically, was imposing taxes on the colonies, and the colonists thought that that was unfair because they didn't have representation in Parliament. So the slogan was no taxation without representation. And you also saw the Boston Tea Party, where tea from an English ship was thrown, or tea that was to be sent to England from the colonies was thrown into Boston Harbor. Now, I've forgotten a lot of the facts. It's been a long time, but that's the gist of it. It was an act of protest against tariffs and taxes and duties and other forms of governmental coercion against the colonists. So Narveson is saying, at a minimum, people who propose to tax citizens and then spend the money for various purposes such as healthcare have to make the case. There should be a presumption against taxes unless a good case can be made in their favor. And Narveson makes another important point in this. He says the fact that the case is not closed or open and shut is suggested by the fact that those people who think there's a positive right to health care, he says, they do not extend it beyond the borders of their own country. So if you really believed that there was a good case to be made for a positive right to health care, why would you limit it to the boundaries of the United States? Why would you say Americans have a right to health care? Why would you not say that people all over the world, wherever they may live, have a positive right to health care? The mere fact that people who believe in a positive right to health care limit it to a particular country suggests that they know that it needs to be argued for. And you can't just assume that there is such a right. By the way, in parentheses at the end of that paragraph, Narveson says, fascism in moral theory surely does not merit serious discussion. And he closes the parenthesis. Now, there are several occasions in this essay where Narveson uses the word fascism. And again, I think that's inappropriate. That borders on name calling. And it goes both ways. Sometimes you see people on the left, the political left, call their opponents, sometimes people on the political right call their opponents communists or socialists. I think that's just name calling. You communist. Someone might say members of the Democratic Party are nothing more than communists. And Narveson, who's on the political right, is saying that people on the people on the political left sometimes say that people on the political right are fascist. So there's name calling going in both directions. Communist, fascist, communist, fascist. Probably that generates a lot of emotion, a lot of heat, but maybe not so much light. So if you look at my notes near the bottom of page 2, let's get clear on what fascism is, and I think you'll see why it's not really appropriate in the context of healthcare. The word fascism in my dictionary, the Oxford American Dictionary, is said to mean the following: extreme right-wing or authoritarian views. Extreme right-wing or authoritarian views. Now, the problem with that is Narveson is focusing his attention primarily on leftists, people on the left side of the political spectrum, progressives. And the last thing you can call them is extreme right-wing or authoritarians, right? So calling them fascist is inappropriate for that reason alone, even if it weren't overheated rhetoric. Fascism, I think by fascism, Narveson means something like collectivism. In Narveson's worldview, there are two ways to look at the social world. There are individualists like him, and there are collectivists. And collectivists are of two sorts. Some of them are on the political left, some are on the political right. And he's opposed to both of them. Narveson would say, a pox on both houses. Narveson, I'm sure, would say, I dislike the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, he's in Canada. They don't have those same two parties, but take my word for it, he's well aware of American political parties. Many Canadians know more about our system of government than most Americans do. Right? Sadly, many or most Americans are apolitical. They couldn't tell you how many houses of our legislature there are, how many bodies there are. They couldn't tell you the name of the Speaker of the House, or maybe even the Vice President. They don't know basic facts about our government, our form of government. And that's sad. Right? Civics education has declined over the years to the point where some citizens know very little about their own government. But Canadians, like Narveson, are very aware of what's going on in this country, in part because we're so much more powerful than Canada. And a lot of the things that are done in America affect Canadians. So they want to see what we're doing, in part because that suggests how things may be going in their own country, as far as economic policy and war and peace and things like that. So back to Narveson. Narveson divides the world up into individualists like him who exalt the individual as against government, and various collectivists. These are people who put a great deal of faith in government, and they believe in collective decision making, and they believe that the collective is more important than the individual, or at least they believe it's more. They believe more strongly than Narveson that the collective has an importance greater than he believes it has. So look at my diagram on page 3. I tried to come up with some classifications that help us understand where Narveson is coming from. If you look at the top row, you'll see a line that separates it into two compartments. On the left, I wrote individualism. Other names for that are classical liberalism, libertarianism, and perhaps anarchism. All of them are individualistic. I'm sure Narveson would call himself a classical liberal. He does call himself a libertarian. He would deny being an anarchist if that means someone who's opposed to all government. But some people use the word anarchist in a broader, looser way, and he might even say he's an anarchist in that way. Now, go over in that same row, go over past the dividing line, and what do you see? You see collectivism, or what's sometimes called statism. Statism. So these are people who do not put the emphasis on the individual. They focus on the group or the collectivity or the state as a whole. And the individual has less status in that way of thinking, less significance. So it's kind of a power struggle. What's the best way to put it? It's a tug of war. Now, suppose here's where the parties are in the tug of war initially. Now, when the rope is pulled this way, that means one side is pulling more strongly than the other side. And sometimes it goes back and forth, right? So Narveson's view is that the individual is paramount and the collectivity has very little significance. The other side believes just the opposite, that the collectivity has a great deal of moral significance and the individual has kind of shrunk in importance. Okay, so Hospers and Narveson are individualists, and they're opposed to collectivism, statism, big government. Now, look at my diagram. You can see that I've made a subdivision within the collectivist camp into left and right. So here are some names for what we might call left-wing collectivists. They're sometimes called welfare liberals, not classical liberals. See that term over on the other side of the line? Not classical liberals, they're welfare liberals. They believe in a welfare state. Sometimes these people are called egalitarians because they want to distribute wealth and income more equally, and perhaps exactly equally. They're called communitarians because they put the community first, not the individual. They're sometimes called socialists or communists, and sometimes they call themselves simply progressivists. They say they have a vision of progress, and their goal is to move us closer to it, often as quickly as possible. Okay? They believe in a progressive form of government that moves us towards some kind of utopian ideal. Now look at the other column. It represents the political right. It has words like totalitarianism in it, authoritarianism, fascism, Nazism, and conservatism. Okay? All of those are right-wing forms of collectivism. And on the other side, you have left-wing forms of collectivism. So Hospers is distancing himself from all forms of collectivism, those on the political left and those on the political right. He would say that he and other libertarians are not collectivists at all. and therefore they're not left-wing collectivists. Therefore, they're not right-wing collectivists. So when Narveson uses the term fascism, I think he's using it to mean collectivism. He's condemning all forms of big government, whether it's left or right. In fact, I'll tell you here something Ralph Nader has said many times in his career. Ralph Nader, in case you don't know, he is still alive. He's a Harvard Law School graduate. He has run for president at least twice, 1996 and 2000. I know because I voted for him both times. Not because I share all of his views, but because I have admiration for him on a personal level. And what I mean by that is Ralph Nader graduated from Harvard Law School, and like any other Harvard Law School graduate, he could have gone into the world of business or law or government. He could have made a lot of money for himself, but he chose not to. He chose a different path. He chose to devote himself in his legal talents to protecting ordinary, everyday people. He, for example, has used his legal talent to change the law on dangerous vehicles. He wrote a book many years ago entitled Unsafe at Any Speed. It was an examination of a particular automobile. I can't remember which one it was, but he believed that that automobile was made by the manufacturer knowingly unsafe. It was made unsafe to save money. And many accidents occurred in which the car blew up. When the car was struck from behind, the gas tank exploded. And there were many awful incidents in which the people in the car were killed, were burned alive as a result of it. So Ralph Nader devoted himself to changing the law to force manufacturers to install safety equipment. And that's just one example of many. Ralph Nader has used his legal talents not to get rich, but to make the world better for other people. So I admire that. I don't agree with many of his positions on political issues, but I voted for him in those two elections to express my admiration for him as a person. Anyway, Ralph Nader once said, and has said many times, and I'll paraphrase, there's not a dime's worth of difference between Republicans and Democrats. They're both captured by powerful, wealthy corporations. It's just that the corporations that support them are different. Right? Both Democrats and Republicans, Nader has said, are both beholden to rich, powerful people and corporations. I think Narveson is saying something similar here. Right? He doesn't talk about the Democrats and the Republicans, I know that. But I think what he's saying is that both the political left and the political right have their own forms of collectivism. They both believe in big government. And we libertarians, Narveson is saying, we reject big government. We focus on the individual. So I wanted to make a comment about his use of the term fascism. Historically, it's inaccurate to call anybody in this debate a fascist. If you look up the term, it originated in Italy. Benito Mussolini was the leader of Italy during World War II, and he coined the term fascist, and he used it to describe his own ideal form of government. And the term caught on, and it's still used today as a pejorative. People like Narveson call their opponents fascists, just as certain other people call their opponents communists. And the term really has little cognitive content anymore. It's just a term of disparagement, right? People, whatever else people know about fascism, they know it's bad. So nobody wants to be called a fascist, and people like to call their opponents fascist in the hope of getting some kind of rhetorical mileage out of it. So I think it's very unfortunate that Narveson stoops to that in this essay. For some reason, he just loves using that term fascist to label and smear his opponents. He should have left it out. He could have used the term collectivism, because I think that's what he means. And that word isn't loaded. In fact, that's probably why he didn't use it. He wants to use a loaded term in the hope of shocking his readers and making his opponents feel guilty about something. Okay, that takes us to the bottom of page 2 and almost to the middle of page 3. I think I'm going to stop right there and pick up with it in 2 days. I know we're only 1 hour into the lecture, but I think we've covered enough, and I think we have enough time in our next lecture to cover the rest of this essay. My voice has been very weak today, and I'm pushing it, so I think I'm going to stop right there. So make sure by Saturday, when I post the second lecture, make sure you've read the entire essay by Hospers and looked over my notes that are posted, and we'll finish things up then. Okay? Have a great day and tomorrow, and I'll see you one more time this week, probably on Saturday.